So from my co-editors, and particularly Gabi, who brought us all together, to the authors, the various people at Routledge, the assistants who kept us all on track, and the students who took my kids on adventures around Tübingen so that we could have an editors meeting in relative peace for a day or two. I think I have only really come to value in-person meetings and knowing that my kids are entertained while I can work over this past year. I think that is a privilege that I will not take for granted in the future. As Gabi mentioned, the book began more than 3 years ago, and I think we had some pretty high goals for the handbook. We were looking for geographic diversity, representation of scholars at different stages in their careers. We wanted to include major institutions and policies, but also some of those things that are often overlooked. We wanted the authors to include intersectional analysis as much as possible. And I think the overall goal was to draw attention to what has been attained in the realm of gender and EU studies and what remains to be addressed. And I hope we've accomplished those goals. Put simply, I think the handbook presents an overview of the key issues in European Union studies through gendered lenses. My personal interest in gendering EU studies began in the late 1990s as a grad student. And I think at that time, as many of you know, there were very few studies that systematically applied a gender perspective to EU integration and EU studies. And I found that really frustrating. Even as a grad student, something wasn't sitting right. There were individual contributions here and there. Of course, Catherine Hoskin's work was seminal and groundbreaking at the time. Ulrike Liebert was already publishing on gender and democracy. And there was some contributions around equality law and employment policy and social policy. And I know I'm probably omitting somebody who was, a key at that stage, but I think that as the field was expanding, I think it's still safe to say that 25 years ago, women, equality, diversity, and gender were at best at the edge of EU studies. And the work was almost never cited by mainstream scholars. And I think this is still a challenge, but look how far we've come. So for me, I think the fact that this handbook showcases over 30 diverse contributions from gender scholars across the disciplines and across intellectual traditions is testimony to the growth and the dynamic nature of gender and EU studies. So I think that we can see this handbook really as a signal that gender and EU studies is a vibrant field of its own, and that gender studies can offer important insights to the mainstream of European integration studies. So we start the handbook with an overview of the history and the fundamentals, and it sets out some of the key debates and conversations that are ongoing in the field. In the opening chapter, we offered a gendered reading of the history of European integration, and we've tried to go beyond the founding fathers and so-called key events to reconceptualize the history of integration through a gendered lens. And I think this idea of reconceptualizing and retelling stories is really at the heart of the handbook. So it's 31 chapters in total, organized around 5 main parts. Following the history, the first section focuses on the theoretical perspectives and the ways in which we can apply a gender lens to a wide variety of approaches to generate new insights, new forms of knowledge. And the authors in this section focused on some of the perspectives that we sort of collectively agreed were particularly fruitful and innovative for reconceptualizing the EU. So we have political economy approaches, social constructivism, Europeanization with a gendered lens. And we felt that these really offered some promise for illuminating the process and the processes of integration. This section also has a theorization of the gender regime, of the construction of masculinities and femininities, and questions of intersectional inequalities in the European gender regime. And then in the second section, we've looked at the institutions, how they're gendered and how they advance gendered norms. So we focus on the main institutions, but we've also tried to bring in some of the lesser researched bodies, the External Action Service, EU agencies, and to try to show that all of these institutions working together in a very complex system are all contributing in some way to the gendered regimes, the gendered values, the gendered norms of the European institutions. The third and fourth sections look at politics and policies. So in the third section, we have research on how politics engages with gendered aspects, zeroing in on questions of belonging, citizenship, and participation. And this is framed especially in the context of the crisis of legitimacy in the EU. And then I think what's really the primary in terms of the number of chapters is in the fourth section around specific policy issues, where we have 8 or 9 chapters with a great deal of diversity around the subject of different policies. And again, there are many more areas, institutions, theories that are not included, but which can and should be brought under further investigation. So in the policy section, we look at monetary union, development, violence, and a host of other issues. Each of our sections begins with some reflections from the editors about what we see as key issues and the gaps in the field, and what we've been able to present in the handbook. And then at the very end, the final section, we tried to tie in some of the contemporary key issues and debates around populism, around Brexit, and to some of these other aspects of this contemporary poly crisis that we might see the European as currently existing within. So I hope that taken all together, we've captured, to the best of our abilities, the diversity and the depth of the field of gender and EU studies, as well as the cooperation and the conversations among feminists and gender scholars between mainstream integration studies and gender studies. But I think it's also important to remember that any handbook can only be a snapshot in time. And so by that, I mean that we have captured a lot of the issues that have been or currently are or we perceive to be emerging issues. But the list of institutions, policies, and issues to consider is far greater than what can be captured in the text. And so I think as this list even expands further through, as the EU continues to expand and evolve and change in its policy directions, I hope that some scholars will also take this handbook as maybe a call to action or a form of call to action to spark and encourage more scholars to consider gender in integration and to continue to subject the European institutions and policies and politics to scrutiny from a gender perspective, because I think, as the handbook shows, we have an awful lot to contribute. So thank you to everybody who contributed. And I will turn over to Anna, I believe was up.
Yes, thank you, Heather. And I would like to start as well with a big thank you, most of all to Gabriela Abels. I mean, for reasons of alphabet, of course, she's always the first person to be mentioned when there are several authors. But in this case, and I hope Heather and Andrea agree with me, I think in this case, this is more than justified, because without you, there would not have been this great handbook. And I think it's amazing the amount of work that you have done, but also the way in which you have managed the whole process, which was not always easy. So I would like to zoom in on the section on EU policies, which was more or less the part that I mainly worked on. And of course, as Heather already indicated, first analysis of EU policies and something with gender, or at that time, equal treatment of women and men. I mean, that was usually the heading. So those first analyses in the 1980s, they were mainly about equal pay, equal access to the labor market, social policies. And what we noticed when we were discussing the setup of the policy section was how this has remained a key focus of much feminist research. And then over the course of the years, it has expanded with work on the gender mainstreaming approach, so the way in which it was applied or not by the EU in other policy domains. But now looking at the outcome, so the 9 chapters in this handbook, what I noticed were the scattered patterns of gender mainstreaming by EU policymakers. This will not come as a surprise to probably all of you, but it is really clear how a gender lens, or let alone a intersectional lens, is still not mainstreamed consistently or to a certain level in any of the policy domains. But there is also a scattering pattern or character of feminist scholarship, which still seems to focus more on certain policy domains than on others. And we also noticed how in mainstream EU handbooks on EU studies, there is still no attention to, well, gender. Well, sometimes there is a single chapter, a standalone chapter, but there is no reference to any gender mainstreaming or intersectional issues in any of the other policy domains. And so this makes clear how important it is to have finally this handbook, where in a very consistent way, we have tried to bring together all scholarship with a gender/intersectional lens, not only in as regards the field of equal opportunities or equal pay or labor market policies, but also on other domains. That said, so this is the most comprehensive, I would say, overview. But there are still three issues. First of all, it is not really balanced in the sense that it becomes so clear how for some chapters, there is very little the EU has done until now. For instance, the violence against women, gender-based violence chapter. It is really very limited what the EU has done there, but there is much feminist scholarship addressing this domain, while in other chapters, it becomes clear how the EU does do some, well, does have something to say in these domains, but there is only limited feminist scholarship. And this is my second point. We did not find authors for certain policy domains, or not really a relevant body of literature for certain policy domains. Also only, well, isolated chapters perhaps, or articles, but not really a body of literature which would justify a full chapter. And so what is missing is, and I'm reading out what we noted, what is missing is a chapter on agriculture and fisheries. This is the call for action, as Heather said. Competition and internal market, education and culture, foreign policy and neighborhood policy, health, very relevant right now, and COVID. I mean, I know that there are some really good articles on this, but there is not a full body on the different aspects of health policies by the EU. Justice, regional policy, taxation and fraud, transportation, and I may still miss out some. So this is really a call for action to do more scholarship on those policy domains which do not seem to be the obvious ones, the usual suspects, but which will not have any, which will not be looked upon from a gender/intersectional lens if we don't do it. And then the intersectional lens, that's the third issue, that it is still very, very difficult to do this consistently, to apply an intersectional lens in any consistent way and to find scholarship applying it. So this is also a call for action to include that in your future work. Thanks to all the authors of specifically these chapters, but of course of all the chapters. And thanks again to Andrea, Heather, and Gabi.
Right, thanks so much, Anna, and thanks for your warm words. And even if my last name wouldn't be Abels, but my mom's maiden name was Alk, so I would still start with an A. That's a bit funny. Okay, Andrea, you and Hermione.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for your interest and for being here. And I want to thank also the editorial team for taking me on board, because I was not so much working on EU lately. And just let me put a little bit of personal background to that, namely that, I mean, talking from Budapest, from Hungary, you know, the country which is maybe one of the most reticent member states, and from a university which has been just chased away from an EU member state, so very much how can I say, very much in the center of some of the EU issues that are some of the problems that the EU is facing, actually. So for a long time in my research, EU meant a lot of optimism, a lot of looking into how countries of the Central and Eastern European region can become better democracies and better member states of the EU and follow gender equality norms better than they did before. And lately it's a lot of disappointment. So also my research moved a lot away from the EU because I was like, okay, this is really not the way to think about the problems that we have. That was my attitude. So just what I wanna gear on is, and then to just make some point, for me, the most interesting part of this volume and the studies that came together here was the one, the focus and the cross-cutting attention to the multiple crises that the EU is facing, and how remarkably gendered those crises are, and how excellent the gender literature is on showing how gendered these crises are, and then the shock to see on the one hand how insensitive and how absent from the mainstream literature on the EU is on EU literature discussing these crises is to gender equality issues, how absent gender is from these discussions, and also how absent is gender and gender mainstreaming, as you say, Anna, from the EU doing anything about these crises, recognizing how gendered these crises are and responding to them in that quality. And I think one of the most, for me, this was the most important contribution of these chapters to actually show how much gender literature can contribute here, and how much, not only in terms of criticizing and identifying the gaps and showing how, for instance, literature on Brexit and on populism says so little about gender, and also identifying how the EU is not responding in ways that would take into consideration gender equality aspects of this crisis, but also in terms of pointing towards what coming from the gender lens could offer actually to rethink the EU in after the crisis, or what can be taken away from this crisis so that the EU becomes a better place and maybe could respond better to some of these major problems that it faces currently. And there is some really nice potential in these chapters and in the thinking that is going on in the gender and politics community around this. So I think that's a really important contribution of the book. And I thought that was, for me personally, and I think maybe for many others, it will be an important part of the book to look at and to take away from it, especially for those of us who are not so focused on the details of the EU machinery and so on, but looking at the EU more as a political actor in this arena. So that's basically for me. It was a joy working with you and with all the authors, many of whom I work with, and they are here in the audience. And I'm really curious about the reception of our book. I'm really curious to see whether it's going to be only gender scholars who look at it, or maybe we have some of these other people who can maybe listen to the research that is now put together and called or brought together in one package and available for accessible for those who might not read gender journals. Thank you.
Hey, yes, thank you so much, Andrea. And of course, it was always very, very helpful to have you, in order not to have only a West European perspective, which happens ever so often still in gender and EU studies, but always also to integrate more the Central and Eastern European perspective and to be more inclusive in that sense as well. Okay, I would like to hand over to Tony, and then to Yvonne as two of our of the kind endorsers we had for the book. Tony, please.
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me to this today. It was very difficult to read your prompt around what's good, what are the blind spots, because I felt that I would be nitpicking at this point. And now, having heard the context, I'm even more worried that, I have nothing critical to say. But let me first say, when the publisher sent the first round of few chapters, I thought to myself, finally, someone is writing this book. Because believe it or not, over the last 5 years, I've spoken to Palgrave in particular to figure out how to do another book from Johanna's book, which is a really long time. It felt like a really long time ago that anyone has done anything substantive. And I said, you need to get in there because I have a relationship with Palgrave. You need to get in there before anyone, gets in there for you. And it seems Andrew was fast on the mark. But of course, I was also pleased that this book was coming out, because it was happening at about the same time that I was working on the EU Africa book. So I, all the empathies with Anna, Andrea, Gabrielle, and Heather. This is a really fantastic achievement. So I'm just going to piggyback on what everyone else has been saying. I think one of the things I really liked about it is the fact that, at least speaking for myself, where I'm sort of more situated within security studies, that this book was able to draw in a range of different disciplines, from political science, IR, sociology, and law. Even within sort of the mainstream texts, it's often the reason why we have a lot of mainstream texts that seem to talk about the same things is because you don't necessarily have those levels of sort of multidisciplinary engagements. So I think that in of itself is, I hate to make that dichotomy between mainstream and not mainstream. But I think what is quite unique about this book on EU politics is that it has been able to draw on different disciplinary lenses. It would not be a surprise, it's not surprising, of course, that a lot of thought went into what should actually go into the book. And I think that, again, a fantastic job's been done there. I've had a chance to not read thoroughly through every chapter, but gone through every chapter. And I've learned a lot of things, shall we say. So as I said earlier, I'm usually in the foreign policy, sometimes Brexit realm. So it was quite lovely to read about the EU agencies, for example, beyond the ones that, we're familiar with. I liked reading the populism chapter quite a bit. The men and masculinities one, because that was the literature that I was not necessarily familiar with in the context of EU studies. But I'm saying everything you know already. You who edited it, you who wrote it, really fantastic work. It was also really nice to see friends on there. As you know, Heather is one of our editors, so I'm always happy to, at JCMS, that is, and always happy to read what she's writing. And so it felt very much like an update in those instances where I was aware of the literature, and in those instances where I wasn't as aware of the literature, it felt like I was learning something new, and really reinforced the importance of gender work, regardless of whether it was in the EU. That ability to bring together people in the first instance, that's the achievement, but also the ability to reflect, like, want to at least leave their disciplinary boundaries to produce a book of this caliber. And finally, I think, of course, it's come at depending on who you ask, the best or the worst time. It's certainly a book that is needed for a lot of reasons that I'm not going to get into. I think Andrea did a fantastic job of the sort of snapshot of why it's not just a book that is good, fun for those of us who are interested in gender to read, but actually a really essential book. And in that sense, this is a fundamental service to the discipline, right? So yeah, we've written I think you've written a fantastic work, and that's good, and yay for that academic work. But I think beyond that, this is a service to the discipline, but also to European politics itself. So here comes the nitpicking. I think for me, the first thing that stood out, I think actually Anna's addressed, was the things that were missing. And I had to think about that. I mean, I think my hunch was exactly what Hannah described, that these aren't necessarily areas where people have done work on that has linked gender to that particular issue area. So for example, agriculture and fisheries, right? I cannot personally, off the top of my head, think of anyone at any European university that is doing something that is very specific to gender and fisheries. But I thought at the same time, perhaps that's why it stood out, because it's not that that work doesn't exist. It perhaps just doesn't exist in our usual circles. And so, you know, that's one call that we do need, if we are indeed committed to whether it's sort of broader critical approaches, intersectionality, that even in the process of trying to move beyond our disciplines, we are still disciplining ourselves. And again, I think this also came from my experience of trying to do the edited book, that, you know, I had to look outside of what I knew and had to reach out to people who perhaps don't necessarily do EU stuff to get them to think about what this particular issue area means in the context of the EU. I see a lot of articles on regional policy and cohesion policy, and I cannot not think that there is so much gender politics going on in there, even if someone doesn't have it as, you know, the title of whatever professorial title they have or that is specific to their work. So I think, you know, perhaps one of the things that this book would do for the future is actually make those people who are working in those areas, who are even perhaps to an extent reflective about some of the inequalities, some of the gendered power relations, but perhaps do not necessarily articulate it as such because they don't necessarily see themselves as EU gender politics people. Perhaps this would be the push that they certainly need to actually engage with the wealth of expertise that already exists on gender specifically, but also a call to us to reach out a bit more. So, but then at the same time, I felt that, you know, there were probably more intuitive areas that would have been nice to be reflective on. So on the one hand, I really enjoyed the chapter on violence against women and gendered violence, perhaps unsurprisingly. But I also thought, well, actually, a chapter on human rights was deserved as well, a gendering of human rights, a chapter on disability rights, because there might be people who don't work on the EU specifically, but there are certainly feminists who work on the ways in which different structures certainly impinge on these different rights. Another area that I thought was would have been interesting for me, even though you know, you kind of get a bit of it. So you had this chapter on feminist political economy, which I thought was really fantastic, and certain synergies with the chapter on social policy. But I started thinking about, you know, given the fact that in the last year we've been talking a lot about leadership, the central bank. The central bank or the reconstruction bank would have been also fascinating. So finance, and not the least because I think, again, that is implicated in some of the crises that we've been talking about. You know, who is coming up with these ideas around, say, austerity, for example. And so in that sense, I thought, you know, in your second edition, no pressure. There are, you know, there is space to be bolder about who you ask to actually get them to think about these things a bit more. And finally, and this is where I'll end, it was something that I thought about just this morning in the context of thinking about other things, is in a way, this book appeals to someone like me who's, number one, been waiting for it and been lobbying for it for a really long time. I get to see my friends write things and the world to actually hear them. But I also think a final chapter that was self-critical would have been really good. So the chapter, like a chapter after the crisis, chapter 1, that perhaps undertook an internal critique of gender in EU politics. Not the least because, you know, the more, I guess, the ways in which, as the years progress, so to speak, we realize more and more that the boundaries of what Europe is quite blurry. And at least speaking for myself, when I'm sort of trying to navigate gender and what it is that the EU does, particularly in external relations, but outside of the boundaries of development, peace and security. You know, it's that murky area outside of those boundaries, the sort of partnerships that the EU engages with, the EU's role in the world, but not necessarily in the world, but the EU as a polity. What does that mean in gender terms, and particularly gender terms that are intended to be intersectional? But perhaps that's an article for the editors. Thanks very much, and congratulations again.
Thank you so much, Tony. And of course, your work really helps, your work as editor of JCMS, together with Roberta and others, to really push gender and EU studies also in one of the key old standing and for a long time really male non-gendered journals in the field. And of course, we would love to see a book review in JCMS. And also, if I may say so, in the Journal of European Public Policy, because I see that the editor of JEP is also with us today. Right.
I should say on that, so, you know, unfortunately, Roberta will back me up on this. There's the journal editors of the book review have absolute editorial autonomy. So I can't tell them what to do, but they do have a policy that says they can't review any book that has an editor in it, which rules out this one in JCMS, because you've got Anik, you've got Heather, you've got Roberta. So this is of all the books published, but unfortunately, I have absolutely no control over that. It's kind of a, you know, but JEP, you know, yes, Journal of European Integration.
More so we rely on JEP then. So thanks, Bertolt. So Yvonne, do you want to come in here, please?
Thank you, Gabby. I will indeed. And good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening, marking the publication of this great handbook. In my endorsement, I said, and I will quote myself here, I said that this superb handbook provides us with cutting-edge chapters on European institutions and European integration by today's leading gender and politics scholars. It is set to become a classic text, providing foundational contributions to teaching and research for many years to come. And I said that on the basis of a selection of chapters that the editors and Routledge sent to me. Now that I have the full print version of 31 chapters, my early evaluation is confirmed. So the editors, Gabriella, Andrea, Heather, and Anna, and the 41 contributors do the study of European politics and European integration an outstanding service with this handbook. Your collective work presents a systematic and well-structured collection of state-of-the-art contributions that takes a gender lens to European Union theory, institutional structures, political and civic arrangements, politics and policies, and wider key contemporary issues. I was really struck by the opening chapter, which clearly sets the tone and focus for the handbook. It reclaims women's contribution to the foundational EU story. This chapter quotes Di Nonno, who points out that, and I quote Di Nonno, she said, "The founding mothers of Europe were convinced that a real European democracy would have been reached only through a greater involvement and empowerment of all individuals. The economic union was not enough." Intellectually, this is an important reclamation of women's agency. Indeed, it deserves, and this I'm talking about the handbook, it deserves wide dissemination, and particularly this first chapter. And there are many possibilities for promoting awareness of women's contribution to the founding and early years of the Union. So I think even in this chapter alone, there is the possibility of action based and arising from it. But when I read that quote, it resonated strongly with me. As a scholar of European Union politics and gender politics, the search for women's agency in European processes at EU and national levels has brought me to address issues of women's underrepresentation, the marginalization of women's NGOs, and member states' variable responses to European-led gender equality initiatives. Often, as I research and write, I feel a tension between what is possible, which is the real politic of EU gender dynamics, and what could be if the EU did not predicate its politics on economic union. So you can see that Di Nonno was expressing this tension that I feel. On better days, though, I marvel at the creativity, the ingenuity, and the sheer doggedness of many gender actors in the EU firmament who have found ways of creating and sustaining a substantive equality agenda from a few lines in the EEC Treaty back in 1958. It is this unresolved tension between what is possible and what could be that keeps drawing me back to studying European Union politics in all its maddening punch-pulling, its negotiated compromises, and its inconsistent practices, which many of the previous speakers have highlighted in detail earlier today. But this is why I find this handbook so compelling. It doesn't shirk from tackling these tensions. It offers a deep and wide discussion of EU politics through a gender lens. It points to the many gaps and the gender blindness of EU studies. Indeed, if this volume is not widely referenced on EU politics courses, then these courses can be considered out of date, deficient in bringing this highly significant dimension of EU politics to the attention of students. So here is a second point of action that I present to all of you. Impressively, the chapters in turn and taken as a whole map the scale of the research awaiting attention. Many of these areas will be taken up by the contributors to this handbook in further research, and there is much awaiting a following generation of scholars. As with all books, there is a feeling of satisfaction at the point of completion and relief in bringing the project to fruition in partnership with the publishing company. From the outside looking in, this collaboration appears to have been a positive and mutually supportive one, and certainly everything that I have heard already confirms that view. I congratulate the editors for managing this complex collaboration and Routledge for doing justice to the scholarship through the production of a most appealing volume. While this is a moment of deserved celebration, inevitably, thoughts stray to what might come next. With this volume, many of the foundational dimensions of EU politics are comprehensively addressed, notwithstanding the considerable research agenda awaiting to be undertaken, as outlined by earlier speakers. But taking a step back from being immersed in this exceptional volume, the where do we go next question arises. For sure, adding more policy cases is very attractive. Developing our understanding of gendered leadership and the gendered nature of structures in the EU is a further theme relevant to our times. Elaborating on theory-driven analytical frameworks is essential work. And there is more with tantalizing potential for gender scholars. I would suggest we could think in two directions. One is developing the comparative dimension, and both institutional and policy studies of the EU are natural locations for this direction. The other route is picking up from a point that Tony mentioned and elaborated on. This other route is to explore a gendered consideration of the place and contribution of the EU in the international order, considered in some of the chapters, yet with more to unfold. As gender and politics scholars, we have important things to say about the shifting nature of global power and the implications this hold for gender equality gains at home in Europe and in global politics. These are my own stray thoughts on where to go next. Tonight, though, we take the time to enjoy the publication of this important book, essential to a full understanding of EU politics. So I congratulate the contributors, the editors, and the publishing house. If I were with you in person, I would clink glasses with you. But that day will surely come, and I look forward to it. So over to you, Gabrielle.
Okay, thank you so much, Yvonne, for your kind words. And whoever has a glass with whatever is inside, yes, let's do a virtual cling at least to the handbook.
So, clink.
Yes, thank you so much. I think we can take a few more minutes to see if there is from the audience any questions, suggestions, ideas that you have. Just unmute yourself if you want to come in. That should work. Some people are congratulating in the chat, so thank you so much for that. Yes, at the moment I can't see anybody raising hands, I think. And there's that number of people congratulated and already said goodbye. Okay, yes, Rosalind says that call me cheeky, I'd be interested in a comment from Jeb, given they are not very warm to gender. Oh, not read that out, sorry. Sorry, Rosalind, but yes, maybe, I don't know, but I don't want to put pressure on you, at least not too much pressure. That I always keep for my husband, the very tough pressure. But maybe you have an idea from Jeb.
Hello, everyone. Also, congratulations for a really fantastic book, and I've privileged to look at it, right from the press, because one of your co-authors that happens to be my wife. And obviously at JEP, we always welcome any contribution on any topic, EU or Europe related. And so just send us your stuff, whatever you have. There's no preconceived notions as to what is right or wrong for the journal. And I think in the past, we have shown that we can also kind of embark on like new shores, not just public policy, narrowly speaking. So send us your stuff.
Hey, thank you very much, Bertolt. And because we have heard from the two endorsers, from Tony and Yvonne in particular, that there are still a lot of gaps in the literature, in the research on gender and EU. And of course, those people who want to work on it, they need places, journals where they can publish that. And I think, yes, thank you for inviting people to hand that in, submit that to JEP. So maybe somebody else wants to come in here.
Can I just
oh sure, Angelika.
I just want to thank the editors. I want to thank you for being on the ball, for herding cats for 3 years, for being patient and then giving us good feedback, and then, you know, leading us in the right direction. And then when the footnotes were wrong again, you were like, just gotta redo this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I know this is so much work and you've done a beautiful job. And I think this volume will stand for a while as a marker of quality and direction. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Angelika. I think one of the good news is what I negotiated with Routledge, since this is not the one and only handbook which they are now publishing on EU politics. There is also the one on critical EU studies, that they want to do one flyer which brings together all new Routledge handbooks in the field of EU politics. And I think that's important to give visibility to our handbook, also to the scholars, to the colleagues who would not consult a gender handbook in the first place, but once they see it, they might get interested in what's inside. So I think that's very helpful, because we are really looking forward to see how this book is discussed, what kind of reviews we will get. And of course, we hope to bring the community, the scholarship forward on these gender and EU issues.
I mean, I think if we are just all of us asking our libraries to, purchase this will already be going to 50 different universities. So, that we can make some start with all of us already.
Right, and please make use of the discount flyer. I uploaded the file with all the information on the chat, because as I said in my intro, we are aware that it's very expensive, like all handbooks are usually way too expensive for like personal purchase, but so it really depends on libraries buying the handbooks and making them accessible to a wide readership at university. Okay, I'm just checking if there's anybody else who wants to come in for a final word. And I would like to mention that in the chat that Johanna Kantola placed the link on their next virtual workshop. Always very good. I've attended all of them. And of course, Johanna and her team, they are doing key work on EU and gender, particularly with regard to the European Parliament. So please, who's ever is interested in that, take a note of that link to the next virtual workshops of the EU Gen Dem project.
Gabriela, if I can just also say hi, and thank you for all of the editors for the fabulous collection. I'm looking forward. I already just emailed my librarian to get it for my university. I'm looking forward flicking through it, reading it. But even just looking at the content, I think it's really nice to see also the efforts you put in to open up the field beyond traditional notions of gender, including masculinity studies, which I think is really great and understudied in the EU. And I'm looking forward to like new editions of this, because obviously you can't always do everything, to even go further and beyond, including sexualities and gender identity. I mean, I know you've definitely tried, and so it's not as a critique, but I think the efforts put in really show, and I just, as someone who is taking that kind of more niche approach, it really is really warmly respected. And thank you so much for putting this wonderful book together.
Okay, thank you very much, Koen. And I've seen that Roberta has raised a hand.
Hi, and I just wanted to echo all the thank yous, because I thought that tonight I think is just wonderful to see everybody here. I just wish we could all be in a physical room together. As we break from what I know has been a really difficult term for most of us in terms of workloads and managing everything, this just gives me a lot of joy. And I think the stuff that is going out on Twitter at the moment echoes that. And I want to thank Joanna for taking a beautiful picture of the screen as well, which I'm going to cherish. The other thing that I also wanted to say, it's actually that one of the points that was made earlier, I think is quite key. And one, it's about not just, talking to ourselves, because, we are the people who cite each other, and we are the people who do this work, but also to actually recognize that the broader discipline needs to engage with our body of literature. And I think actually the point that was made earlier, I think is key. And it really shows that the way that at least one of the leading journals has gone about doing this can really lead the field in terms of talking the talk as well as, walking the walk as well as talking the talk. And I think that is key. And I, as a movement, as a group of scholars, I think this is the start, but we need to do so much more. And the other point is the one that was made by Tony, is about reflexivity, both in terms of the broader discipline, which we're asking EU studies to be more reflexive of its own cognitive biases and silences, but also we need to be aware of our own. And I think that's kind of quite key. But I think this is a great starting point for what I think is going to be a fantastic discussion. And I can't help but to think back to when I started my PhD, and there was nothing published on gender and the EU. And then 2 years before I finished, Catherine Hoskins published the first book. And, how far have we come in the space of obviously only about 10 years since I finished my time? How far have we come, in the space of not so long? So it's been fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roberta. And just picking up on your what needs to be done looking forward, that's of course one of the reasons why we put the front cover picture, right? Having these two women, supposedly a white woman and a woman of color, being maybe protected by the EU, but looking into the future and see what it brings, and going together. And we felt that this is a nice metaphor also in political terms, but definitely also in terms of doing research on gender and EU politics. So we hope you like it, because as many of you probably know, just picking a nice front picture is not always easy, because people have different views about aesthetics and all that. So that was quite nice. And then I see the hand raised by one of our contributors. Yola, please.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Gabrielle. Hi, all the editors. Thank you. Just an apology. I forgot that this was scheduled for Central European time, so I logged on time at 6 o'clock. So you've already been talking for an hour, and I've missed most of the discussion, which I'm really upset about. But thank you for organizing this online launch. I think it's a wonderful idea. And I just wanted to echo, it's probably already been said before, but thank you so much for really reaching out across the traditional silos to ensure that this volume really is reflective of of all women, in particular Black women. I have to say it's the first time I've been invited to contribute to a volume specifically focusing on gender in the European Union. And as somebody who has studied the European Union, written about the European Union, and taught about European Union law now for about 20 years, I was very pleased to finally receive that invitation. So thank you very much. And it's wonderful to be in a volume with all of these people, all of you on screen, whose work that I'm also familiar with over the many decades. So thank you. And I look forward to doing whatever we can together, together again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Yola. And of course, we hope that this will bring colleagues together who in the past haven't worked together, but who might feel after reading chapters that they have a lot to talk to about with each other, and that they can start joint research efforts in the future. Okay. Right, so it's my pleasure that you all were here with us today and celebrated with us. And as I said in my intro words, of course, we hope next year, summer 2022, that we can meet at the ECPG conference in Ljubljana, and then have a follow-up reception and have a conference party and have another toast to a handbook. It was a lot of work, but it was also a lot of fun to work with all of you, and I really enjoyed it. I'm not sure if I want to do another handbook for the next 5 years, but maybe before I retire, which is still 10 more years to go. Right. So to all of you, have a nice evening, have a happy Easter, and stay safe. And we meet again in different days, different times, in person again. So thank you, everybody, and cheers to the handbook and to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you in Ljubljana next year.